Figure it out.
Hello, this is Adam Koralik from Figured Out Productions. The following video is a video of some kind, and I hope you enjoy it.
Hey guys, it's Adam here, and welcome to part 11 of my fourth video game generation retrospective or recap series. Yes, okay, I know, part 11. Obviously there's a lot of other videos in this series, and the majority of them were done years ago. However, I finally now have my hands on a Neo Geo CD. Well, okay, I got a Neo Geo CD a couple of years ago, but now I actually have time to sit down and make the video. So, if you're watching this in the playlist, yes, it's all been added retroactively, and thank you for watching the rest of the videos. And if you're just joining this as a new video, hey, what's up? So today we're going to talk about this thing. Now, I actually have talked about it a little bit in this series previously when I talked about the Neo Geo AES, SNK's first home console, which was a cartridge-based console, which was an impressive thing for its time, which we'll go into in just a little bit. This, however, was the follow-up to it, and it did not deliver the same success, yet is still a very neat console. And to me, it's fascinating for a whole host of reasons. One of which is that I feel that this console falls into a very strange crack that I can't seem to find any other console that does. And what I mean by that is, before making this, I decided, you know, one of the things that was going to kind of spur my energy and get me to do the video was I kind of wanted to hear people talk about this console and kind of get me excited so that I would want to talk about it. So I went to YouTube and stuff, looking it up, and the only videos that really came up were the same ones that have been there forever, including some on mine. And literally, two of them are just the cleaning videos that I did on these exact two consoles that are on the table. Then there's some other videos of like hardware reviews and stuff like that, but that's about it. It was strange. It's not like with the PlayStation 1 or something where like every single person ever who's like interested in retro games has made a video on it. Nor is it so obscure that everyone who has an Apple Pippin, all 6 of us, have made videos on it. You know, I mean, I know I did that. But that's like a point of pride thing, I guess. That's not really why I did it, but it's a thing. The Neo Geo CD is interesting in that like every retro gamer has heard of it. A lot of us even have it. Not tons of us, admittedly, but a lot of super collectors actually do have it. But nobody ever really seems to talk about its story, its history, anything like that. It's actually surprisingly limited in the amount of content that's out there for this particular console. There's videos of people playing the games, but the console itself and its story, not so much. And I don't really know why. So I thought, perfect, that is a great motivator. We can do it ourselves today. So that's exactly what we're going to do. Now, to understand the story of this console, one must first understand the basics of the Neo Geo AES. Now, again, I did a whole video on it, but to recap the recap, basically what happened is that SNK came along and said, hey, we're going to make an arcade-perfect console for everyone, or in theory, which was at the time a big deal. Arcades were significant, and every console company was promising, hey, ours will be like the arcade, but they couldn't really be like that because it was too expensive. SNK, on the other hand, made the Neo Geo AES, which basically was exactly arcade perfect, but the price reflected that, and it was just too expensive for a lot of people. Yet, somehow, despite doing almost every single thing wrong from an economic standpoint and a marketing standpoint, the Neo Geo AES was successful. It was like the Rolls-Royce of game consoles. But there was a point that came along where SNK went, look, why don't we try to appeal more to the casual market, the console market, the people that could actually afford our stuff? You know what I mean? Like, why don't we go to that market? And along came the idea for the Neo Geo CD. Now, the Neo Geo CD is interesting because basically all it is the Neo Geo AES. They got rid of the cartridge slot and replaced it with a CD-ROM drive. And they released it on September 9th, 1994. Now that's interesting for a few different reasons. One, waiting that long wasn't a bad idea. By that point, the actual technology that was within the AES was a lot cheaper. Two, CD-ROM technology had come along quite a bit from the very late 80s, early 90s right there, where it was super unreliable and super expensive. By this point in the 90s, it was much more feasible to be able to have a CD-ROM based console and have it not be prohibitively expensive. That would also drive down the cost of games. Neo Geo AES games could, not always, but could retail at $500, whereas Neo Geo CD games would go between like $50 to $80. It was a much more reasonable price tag. So that was kind of where their headspace was at. It's cheaper now, some time has gone by, let's basically use the same hardware and go to another market. And rather than using the giant arcade stick that came with the AES, they actually came out with this new controller design, which I actually think is the far superior controller. This is the home console edition type of controller. And beautifully, both of these consoles are basically backwards compatible with each other in terms of certain aspects, one of them being the controller. The controller ports are exactly the same on the Neo Geo CD as they are on the AES. So you can use this controller on an AES. You can use the AES arcade stick on this console, and vice versa, which I think is great. The same with the RGB cables out, although sometimes that can be wrong and it'll display, but it won't display in RGB. It's a whole different thing. But anyway, so the only thing they screwed up was the power supply. For some reason, the Neo Geo CD ones, they went proprietary, but we'll get back to that. But for the most part, that was cool. It was also interesting because from SNK's perspective, these guys only made 2 consoles ever, the AES and the CD, and both of them are 4th generation video game consoles, which is strange. They are the last company that ever did that, unless we include Nintendo, which we might. The Wii U and the Nintendo Switch are both debatably in the same generation. I know people go nuts in the comment section over that, and I'm not here to make that call just yet. It's not my decision to make, but I'm in the camp of it. They're probably the same generation, and they're the first one to do it since SNK, but I'm not saying for sure that that's actually what happened. That doesn't matter. So, but in this case, it definitely happened. These are both, well, CD and the AES are both 4th generation game consoles. What's also interesting about that is this is the last 4th generation game console. In fact, it was so late in the 4th generation that no less than 4 5th generation game consoles had come out. The Fujitsu FM Towns Marty, the Commodore Amiga CD32, the 3DO, I was going to say Panasonic 3DO, but it's not really theirs, the 3DO, and the Atari Jaguar had all been released. Granted, early 5th generation game consoles, but they did all exist. And the other big players, some not so big, but other big players were right around the corner. A couple months later, both the PlayStation and the Saturn were going to launch. In fact, this thing, at the time it came out, the next console after it, which was a 5th generation console called the Bandai Pladia, which, yeah, not a big winner, obviously, but that was a 5th gen console. It launched 2 weeks after this thing. So this thing was like it was a crack in time when it first came out, and will, I think, be a crack in time throughout its entire history. Its whole story is like that. It's just bizarre. Because the other thing about it is, it's actually really good. It has a lot of really good games on it. And in my opinion, it might be one of the most import-friendly consoles that ever existed. See, these days, when it comes to a new game, a lot of games are obviously very dialogue and text intensive. So you can't just pick up and play any game from any region. Even if we get past the whole region coding thing, which fortunately now it is not as big of a deal as it once was. But even if you get past that, like, I can't just buy a game in Japan and be like, oh good, it's going to play in English, or English doesn't matter, I can just play this. There are obviously cases where that's true, but a lot of the time it's like, oh, okay, I can't read this part, oh, I can't do that part. Because of the arcade nature and history and foundation of this console, most of the games in its library anyone can pick up and play. Not all, there are definitely exceptions to that, but for the most part, they're pretty much all just playable stuff that anybody can jump into, and I think that's really neat. And on top of that, the console itself actually was region-free. So any region in which you bought the disc would work in any version of the console, though that doesn't matter too much, and we'll get into why right now. So when they launched the console in 1994 in Japan, this version right here, the front loader, was the version that they put out. And that was, in my opinion, a mistake. This thing is big, it's bulky, it's not super reliable, and it was much more expensive for them to produce. This is known as the front loader. They realized that mistake pretty quickly. They only produced 25,000 of these before discontinuing it and eventually moving on to this version. This is the most common version over here, known as the Neo Geo CD top loader. This version came out in early '95 for Japan, and it also came out in Europe. Now, this version was supposed to come out in the United States, but most of the criticism they were getting from Europe as well as Japan was, hey man, the load times on this thing really suck. Like, they really suck. And which is true. Some of these games, between sequences, can be up to 60 seconds in load time. Now that's extreme. Most of the time it hovers between around 15 to 25, something like that. But still, that's a lot of time. Even at that point in '94, You know, that's like, man, that's not super forgivable. So when it came to the American launch, they're like, okay. And the reality is the American market, especially then, is the biggest video game market. That's where most of the money is going to come from. You can't screw that one up. So they were like, we're going to go ahead and fix that. So they decided to slate the release for late 95. And what they were going to do is take all the CD-ROM units they had ready to go, take them out, and correct them. I'm not entirely certain how they planned to do that, but apparently that was the plan. They were going to tweak every single drive and basically double the read speed on all of them. That way it would alleviate the loading issue, or basically bring it down. They eventually realized that was not financially viable to actually do that, and then they ended up releasing the console in very early 1996. So they delayed it and delayed it and delayed it, and by the time they released it, they didn't even fix the issue that was the reason they had delayed it in the first place, which definitely hurt them. Because by 1996, in North America especially, dude, we're all talking Nintendo 64. Like, and everyone's got a PlayStation, Saturn's out already, and N64 is right there. Nobody's going to be diving into a Neo Geo CD at that point. And that was really kind of the downfall of it. In Japan, they did eventually correct that issue by releasing something known as the Neo Geo CD. I do not own this console. I do have a friend that has one. It is much better. The load times on it are basically cut in half. It is definitely the version that they should have released from the get-go, but it's just not how it played out. And by 1997, this thing was completely dead. SNK was no longer supporting it. They had dropped it, and basically what little support they were still putting into anything, they were putting into the Neo Geo AES. And more or less, guys, that's the story. Like I said, it came out in Europe. They might be more common in Europe than they are here in the States. I have never, as far as I recall, seen an American version of this console. This version is the only one we did get, but this one in particular is Japanese. This definitely never came out here, nor did the CDZ. And while I have actually seen some of the American Neo Geo CD games, you'd have to go to places that know exactly what they are. That's the only time you'll ever see them. And even then, not very often. So definitely, to me, a fascinating console. And it's kind of cool just like thinking about the evolution of it and the story behind it and how just weird it is. Because, like I said, I think everybody kind of already knows what it is and nobody even really investigates its own story. But it is, to me, a fascinating console. Now, when we look at the first loader, the first model here, like I said, it's a big unit. The tray comes out of there. And on the back, you have this annoying proprietary power supply, which is a problem. That's actually, I mean, it worked out in my favor, as I'll explain later, but it's stupid that they had this proprietary. I do not like proprietary stuff like this. It just makes it harder in the long run to be able to use them, which is ironic because they actually used standard composite and S-video ports on it. It also used an AV port that actually looks a lot, if not is identical to the Sega Genesis Model 1 pin output. However, the pins themselves do not align correctly, so you can't actually use those cables on it. But the thing itself does support RGB, and there are cables for it specifically, so you can get beautiful RGB out of this thing. The same cables will fit into an AES, but one of the things about the AES and the CD is they're not always compatible in that regard. There's something like certain models of the AES and certain models of the Neo Geo CD can use the same RGB SCART cable, another one can use the same, but not always. They're not always cross-compatible. I think I got lucky because mine seemed to do that just fine. But yeah, bizarre. And then when you take a look at the Model 2, or the top loader, this is my preferred design between the two that I've got. It's in beautiful condition. As you can see, it has this vent up here on the top. It uses the same power supply. If you have to keep it, I guess at least you kept it across all versions. It still uses composite out native, S-video out native, and the same RGB SCART port. And then, yeah, you just press that and pop up, and there it is. Power button right there, and then two controller ports. Same controller ports, like I said, that are on the AES as well. Very, very cool. Now, let's talk a bit about some of the games before we ultimately talk about, I think, my experience with it, and then a little bit of its legacy. So, as you can see, I have a ton of games for this thing. The reason for that is that, to me, this is a console that I don't want a full setup because it's prohibitively expensive. There's a lot of games on it that are just they just cost too damn much. Especially there are some games that were exclusively made for the Neo Geo CD and never came out on the AES. Those are the worst offenders. But for the most part, they were essentially ports from the AES, possibly in some cases with better sound and so on. But really, it was just meant to be a cost-saving measure. But there's only ultimately something like 80 games for it. And as you can see, I have like half of them already. Because in Japan, they're just not much money if you can find them. Now, a lot of these, the names are in Japanese, so I'm not going to know what they are offhand, but forgive me, we'll just try here. But this is everything I currently own for it. Most of them, by the way, are fighting games, which is not surprising. I believe this one's called Aggressors of Dark Combat. ASO Last Guardian 2, it's a shoot 'em up. Art of Fighting 2, Art of Fighting 3, I believe. Baseball Stars 2. Legitimately, I do not remember. I think this one's Far East of Eden. This one's Fatal Fury Fatal Fury King of Fighters. It was like a combo versus game. Fatal Fury 3 Road to Final Victory. Fatal Fury Special. Fighters History Dynamite. The Quest for Jong Master. I don't remember. Some sort of Mahjong game. King of Fighters 94, King of Fighters 95, King of Fighters 96, King of Fighters 97, King of Fighters 98, King of Fighters 99, Last Blade, Last Resort, League Bowling, Mahjong Story, Metal Slug 2, Neo Geo CD Special, Power Spikes 2. Let me put these back real quick. As you can see, lots of fighting games. Like, SNK was always known for that, so it's really not surprising that that would be the primary thing that they would be putting out and making available on their consoles. And like I said, the coolest thing about that, though, is that they're pretty much all of these games are just anyone can pick up and play. You might suck at it like I do in a lot of cases, but you can play it. Puzzle Bobble, this is like some sort of History of King of Fighters puzzle game. Rally Chase, Real Bout Special, Real Bout Special 2, The Newcomers, Riding Hero, Samurai Spirits 2, Samurai Spirits 3, Samurai Spirits 4, or RPG, I think this is what that one's called. I don't remember. Shinoken or something like that. Soccer Brawl, Sonic Wings 2, Sonic Wings 3, Stakes Winner GI Jockey. This is like a horse racing thing. This is actually one of the few games where I think, unless you can read Japanese, there's no way you could play this. Not that I would have any interest in that one. Anyway, some sort of soccer game, or super real soccer game, something like that. The Super Spy, Top Hunter, Roddy and Kathy, Flying Power Disc, which I don't know, I think this has a different name. World Heroes 2 Jet, and World Heroes Perfect. Again, more fighting games. But yeah, right there, guys, is pretty much half of the Neo Geo CD library. Now, it's one of the things that's kind of interesting about it is, I think while a lot of the games on this console are good, is they're largely inaccessible for reasons previously stated. Like, nobody has this console. Nobody really had access to it. Now, if you want one, they're not hard to get in Japan. That's the interesting thing. So this, for a long time, if you've been watching my channel for years, you know that there was a time when people would ask me, like, what's the #1 console you want at that point? It was always Neo Geo CD. That was always like, hey, that's the thing I would love to pick up, because it would just be fun to collect for that, and I know it has a lot of good stuff on it. But getting one in North America is not an easy task. I mean, financially anyway. So here's what happened with me. On one of my first trips to Japan, I was up in Tokyo, and I was hanging with my buddy Fox. And he took me down to Akihabara. It was actually the first time I'd ever been down there. Now, I don't really like Akihabara, to be honest with you. I think Akihabara is a great spectacle. It's cool. It's got a lot of stuff to see. But if you're going there specifically to buy stuff, then that's a bad place to go. They're going to have a lot of stuff you like, but the prices will reflect the convenience of it. And that's up to you if you want to do that or not. Personally, if I'm there to, like, hunt for video games, I'm not going to go to, like... That's, to me, is like... you put it in hunting terms, right? It's kind of like hunting. You go into the forest and you sit there and you wait for the deer or whatever, and then you get it. Or you can go to a petting zoo and just shoot them in the face. That's pretty much what Akihabara is. It's just this like super easy way to get the thing you want. It's just, where's the challenge? And it feels awful because you're basically cheating. But anyway, so I was there regardless just to see the spectacle, and I went into Super Potato, which is a very famous video game store, and again, the prices reflect that. Slightly better than eBay, and that's why all the tourists like it. That's the other reason I don't like it, is just nothing but tourists. But, not that I'm even from there, but that's just how it feels. You just feel like, ugh, I feel gross here. But, whatever. So we're walking around the Super Potato, and I wasn't expecting to buy anything in there, but they had a junk bin, which is not a really common thing at a Super Potato, because usually everything there reflects the price that they want to sell it to you for. And so I saw this junk bin, and inside there were two things: a Famicom disk system, and the other thing was this, the front loader Neo Geo CD. I immediately grabbed it, just grabbed it, didn't even think about it. It had a yellow sticker on it that just said broken, and then it also said the price, which was 2,000 yen, which is about $18 US. And I was like, I don't even care if it's broken. That's an amazing deal. So I wonder what's wrong with it, because I've known that for a long time in Japan, when they say something is junk or it's broken, that doesn't usually mean that. It's just the quickest way of saying, like, it's not quite right and we don't want to deal with it. So I was just optimistic that that would be the situation. Long story short, I got it back here, and like I said, stupid power supplies are proprietary. I hate that. But obviously, cable-wise, I didn't have an issue with that. And the controller, I was able to test it with an arcade stick. That was fine. I eventually found a guy who was selling third-party power supplies that he was making himself for the Neo Geo CD, as odd as that is. I got one. It wasn't particularly expensive. And I fired it up, and immediately it powered up. So I was like, oh, cool. Like, that part works. Great. And then I checked it out to make sure it worked on the TV, and we had a nice display. The screen came up. Controller was responsive. I'm like, all right, we're hitting this here. I hit eject on the thing. Disc tray comes out. I was like, oh, score. And inside, there was a game. There was a copy of Real Bout Fatal Fury in there. And I was like, oh, awesome. I closed the lid, and I was like, here we go. Let's see if it actually reads a disc. And it did. It worked. And I couldn't believe it. I was like, I don't get it. I think the only reason it was in the junk bin is because they didn't have the power supply. The original power supplies are not common. They are probably more expensive than the console, like by itself, obviously. So it was like, yeah, let's not deal with it. Let stupid Gaijin buy it, and it'll be his problem. But I got it, and it wasn't my problem. It worked out just fine. So yeah, that's why I have this one. A while later, I was in Japan. Specifically, I was down in the Kansai area. I went south of Osaka, and I found a Hard Off, which is like a hardware store. Well, they call it that, but really it's an all-purpose like junk store. And they have big video game sections. And so I was going through the video game sections, and I saw some boxed consoles. And one of them was a Neo Geo CD top loader. This one, in the box, with 2 controllers, original power supply, manuals, all that stuff. Great condition. As you can see, it's beautiful. 80 bucks. Of course I was going to pull the trigger on that. So I got that, brought it back, and so I got both of these Neo Geo CDs combined for less than $100. I think that's a steal, man. Yeah, so the funny thing is, though, like I said, growing up, I certainly didn't know anybody who had one of these because it barely came out here. It was a console I had become aware of at one point, but by the time I was aware of it, nobody had one. So that's why I think it always kind of struck a chord with me as being kind of interesting. From a legacy standpoint, it was the last time that SNK ever made a console. And interestingly, they always had this weird mutual partnership with Sega. Even though they were competitors, they tend to work together a lot. SNK made a lot of games for Sega hardware. Sega even made some games for SNK hardware, most notably the Neo Geo Pocket, but still they did make some games for them. And yes, I know the Neo Geo Pocket came out later, but that's not a home console, it's a portable, but whatever. But they had this working relationship to the point where even the Neo Geo Pocket had a link cable that connected to the Dreamcast. So SNK made games for the Dreamcast that had Neo Geo Pocket versions. There was this cross-compatibility, so you could get extra characters and all that kind of stuff. Point is, there was always this kind of respectful relationship between the two companies, which I've always kind of appreciated because they were both very similar companies. SNK actually made a lot of games for the Dreamcast well after everybody else had jumped ship on it. So in a way, it's kind of fitting to see what ultimately happened with Neo Geo CD games is it turns out the Dreamcast is actually really good at emulating and ultimately playing Neo Geo CD games. So much so that one guy, an independent publisher for the Dreamcast, his name is Josh Prod, well, the company's name is Josh Prod, has worked with one company in particular called Visco, who is a third-party developer who made a lot of games for the console. He's got them to officially license those games for release on the Dreamcast, and all they really do is take the Neo Geo CD emulator, put that in front of the data of the Neo Geo CD game, and then do a little bit of fine tuning to make sure everything's kind of bug free or whatever, and then ultimately just release it. And so really, if you want to play Neo Geo CD games and you own a Dreamcast, most of this library is accessible to you, which is really very cool that people have taken the time to make that effort. It's cool. It's like the Dreamcast gets almost 80 new games basically by doing that. The Neo Geo CD gets to kind of live on in the form of another console, and people who never had the chance to experience it due to the lack of not having real hardware also get now a chance to play it. And of course, theoretically anyway, the load times are substantially better. Not theoretically, definitely are a lot better running on a Dreamcast. But that said, I still love the fact that I can actually sit here and play it on real hardware if I actually want to. Which is awesome. But yeah, I think that's kind of about it. There's not really much else to say about it. If you want one, my guess is this is the version that most of you would be able to get for financial reasons. It's also the most common version. It seems to be relatively reliable. I've never had any issues with mine. But yeah, you can always definitely, you can get these in Japan. You will find them. This one, not as easily, and the CDZ will cost you money. That's the most commonly imported one, but yeah, it is definitely doable if that's interesting to you. So I want to thank you guys, because this is the end of this particular series, because I think we're completely out of consoles in this generation, unless I missed one. If those ever happen, sure, maybe we'll throw them in there. But aside from that, this is definitely where the series would end, regardless. So I want to thank you guys for having watched this, and all the other previous episodes, hopefully. If you guys could please like, comment, subscribe, and all that great stuff, I'd super appreciate that. Thank you very much for watching, and I'll see you all later.